Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the high-level convening on United Nations Counterterrorism and Human Rights. I'm Nicholas Miller from the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law.
And I am Yasmin Ahmed from Rights and Security International. We are representing the coalition of 11 civil society organisations that have convened this event and over 40 civil society organisations from around the world. Our organisations work to promote human rights, humanitarian assistance and peace.
Our coalition has organised this particular event to promote a more inclusive, people-centred approach to counterterrorism in the United Nations and in the post-COVID world.
We are pleased to say that we have over 1,000 people registered for this event today, including representatives from over 70 states, 400 CSO partners from over 50 countries around the world, and hundreds of UN representatives. This demonstrates to us the urgency and importance of this discussion we will have today, and we thank you very much for joining us. And we remind you to use the hashtag #ReformUNCT on social media.
Thank you, Yasmin. With that, and with no further delay, we want to start the substantive discussion. So I will pass the metaphorical microphone over to our moderator, Vivian Newman Pont. Vivian, we are so pleased that you're joining us for this. You are the Executive Director of Dejusticia in Colombia, and we can think of no one better suited for this than you. The microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants to this opening session of the high-level convening on United Nations Counterterrorism and Human Rights. We are gathered remotely in this opening session thanks to a call from civil society that wants to be a meaningful and permanent part of the counterterrorism strategy development in the UN with a more effective and inclusive human rights-based approach. I would first like to briefly introduce the subject of the panel, then present the outstanding panelists that I had the honor to moderate, after which I will proceed with 2 rows of 1 question for each one of them so that we can end with questions from you, the public. So let's start. There is no secret in acknowledging that the UN counterterrorism strategy has excluded a sustained dialogue with civil society in its design and construction with an effective human rights approach. In addition, UN Office of Counterterrorism has announced its intention to go ahead with Counterterrorism Week in early July, with also very limited voice of civil society. Now, in the compliance of the strategy in each country, there seems to be even less participation of civil society and human rights perspective, not only in the creation of the law, but in its enforcement. In countries like the Philippines, for instance, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 has been passed against civil society and is now just waiting for the signature of President Duterte with overbroad terms of terrorism, and also affecting the rights to freedom of expression, assembly, privacy, due process, and non-discrimination. In my country, Colombia, one of the most dangerous countries in the world for human rights defenders, according to UN Special Rapporteur on the subject, in part because of wrongly understood terrorism, there is a clear jeopardy for seriously peace-building efforts of civil society and social leaders. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic makes this situation more complicated because it is a civil sanitary crisis under the risk of being framed as a threat to national security. It is therefore more important than ever to have a proper balance between the rights of the citizens and, on the other side, the authority, especially in countries affected by terrorism. In times of exceptions, such as this pandemic, civil society has to be more present and acquires a key role to contribute to the system of checks and balances for which a human rights-centered counterterrorism strategy is more urgent than ever. With this difficult backdrop, I will start presenting our panelists in strictly alphabetical order. First, Hina Jilani, co-founder of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan and the Women's Action Forum, and former UN Special Representative on Human Rights Defenders. She is a member also of the eminent jurist panel on terrorism, counterterrorism, and human rights. Ambassador Kais Kabtani has served as ambassador of Tunisia for the African Union and other countries in the continent, and currently serves as permanent representative of the Republic of Tunisia to the United Nations, representing Tunisia at the Security Council for this period 2020-2021. Third, Navi Pillay was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 2008 to 2014. Pillay has also served as a judge of the ICC and president of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Last, Ambassador Agustín Santos Maraver, advisor in several periods to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Spain, and ambassador permanent representative of Spain to the United Nations in Geneva and now in New York. So we proceed with the questions of the panel, also in the strict alphabetical order, starting with question for Ms. Jilani. Hina, your country, Pakistan, just like mine, Colombia, has seen its share of challenges with terrorism. I believe there have also been issues of counterterrorism laws and regulations, in theory and in practice, being used to silence human rights defenders, which is something other countries have also seen. What has been the impact of counterterrorism measures on human rights, civil society, and civic space? Can you tell us in just, 3 minutes?
I'll try. Let me first of all thank the organizers for convening this event and giving me the opportunity to make my contributions to this very necessary and timely discussion. In the limited time I have, I will only be able to flag some of the more important issues in the context of Pakistan. However, I think it must be noted that many of these trends are not unique to my country alone and reflect the general concerns regarding counterterrorism globally. For years preceding the UN efforts on counterterrorism, we have seen an arsenal of special counterterrorism laws that bypassed due process and fair trial procedures, reduced legal safeguards, and we saw a shift from a criminal justice to an intelligence and military response with no accountability, which resulted in impunity for torture, disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and secret detention. Now, a broad definition was given to terrorism, and this was deliberately designed to suppress dissent and to target especially freedoms of expression, of association, and the right to protest. The regular criminal justice system was bypassed and special courts have been established to deal with terrorist crimes. Consequently, no attention was paid to enhancing capacity of the normal justice system to deal with crimes of terror. Instead, military courts were given exclusive jurisdiction to try terrorism-related offenses, thus militarizing the criminal justice system in violation of international norms and to the detriment of due process and fair trial. Military operations were carried out in certain parts of the country with dubious legal sanctions, bypassing the legitimate lawmaking process. These military operations are notorious for lack of transparency or clarity regarding the rules under which armed action was undertaken. No independent scrutiny was allowed to assess conformity with standards of international human rights or international humanitarian. Even if such scrutiny was possible, it would have been extremely difficult to assess compliance because of the obscurity in characterization of the operation. Sometimes they were proclaimed to be law enforcement operations by the military, and at other times, the war paradigm was used to justify extrajudicial killings and massive destruction caused by the use of force. It is post these operations that we see and hear through the voices of the affected populations how both terrorist activities and counter-terrorism military operations caused civilian deaths through use of indiscriminate and deadly force, and also the massive harm to human security.
Hina, I'm afraid Hina, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We'll have another extra time afterwards. I'll stay with the suppression of dissent, with the obscurity of the operations, the military operations, and the extrajudicial killings that sound very familiar to me. I'll just pass on to the next one, and then I'll come back to you. So I'll just give the floor to Ms. Pillay now. I'm sorry for that. In your time as High Commissioner, Ms. Pillay, you talked about the devastating consequences of terrorism, but also noted that a nation's response to terrorism must be holistic and protect human rights. Have your views on this human rights centered approach changed since? What are your recommendations on this balance that we need to maintain between security and freedoms and human rights? Do you still believe that? And if so, why? So many questions and just 3 minutes for you, Navi. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Let me first say how pleased I am to participate in this civil society initiative on a problem that I also see is growing all around us. It's very alarming, the threat of militarization and securitization of the counter-terrorism mechanism. So you are quite right. It was in 2013, as the then High Commissioner for Human Rights, I addressed the United Nations Security Council's Counter-Terrorism Committee and said that acts of terrorism continue to have real and direct impact on human rights. I spoke of the devastating consequences of terrorism on the ability of individuals to fully enjoy their human rights, and that acts of terrorism destabilized governments, undermined civil society, jeopardized peace and security, and threatened economic and social development. And an effective response, I felt, required states to adopt a holistic and integrated approach that protected human rights and respect for the rule of law. So, of course, the UN resolution of 2001 imposed the obligation on states to implement more effective counter-terrorism measures. But in resolution passed in 2003, the Security Council also imposed an obligation on all states to ensure that any measure taken to counter terrorism complies with all their obligations under international law, and the measures should accord with international law, refugee law, international humanitarian law, and human rights law. So the balance is that was sought is to strike a fair balance between legitimate national security concerns and the protection of fundamental freedoms. That balance is reflected in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. High Commissioners before me and after me, and multiple independent experts from the special procedures treaty bodies have all regularly reported since of the rampant violations of human rights by states in the practice of measures to counter terrorism. And they have all, and me too, have called on the committee, TTITF, task force to strengthen efforts to protect respect for human rights and rule of law, and said that's a fundamental basis of the fight against terrorism. And all of us underscored that only rights-based policies will have lasting prospects of combating terrorism. So while we condemn terrorism unequivocally, we recognize the duty of states to protect those living in their jurisdiction, and that is you and I. The priority of counterterrorism measures then should be the protection of people, and therefore it is incumbent on governments to act upon discussion and dialogue with civil society, not that they should be acting against them. So instead, these counter-terrorism measures are used for action against civil society, law
Navi?
enforcement. Is my
Navi?
time? Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'll pause there. I'll stick to that, the priority of the protection of people. That was the last sentence that I want to embrace, and we'll have time afterwards. I'll have to apologize because for some reason in my alphabetical order, Navi came before Ambassador Kabtani, and this was my mistake. So I'll go back to question for Ambassador Kabtani, and then I'll replace that. Ambassador Kabtani, Tunisia has faced challenges with terrorism, but it is also the home of a vibrant civil society. Would you please tell us about Tunisia's experience of cooperating with civil society in its efforts to counter terrorism, both in its role as chair of the Security Council's Counter-Terrorism Committee and domestically? What lessons can you share with all of us here from this experience?
Good morning, everyone. And in the beginning, let me thank you for inviting me to this high-level event. It is my pleasure to contribute to this very timely discussion as a way to showcase a continued focus on counterterrorism and human rights issues at a time when the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic seems to be consuming most of the international attention and resources. Indeed, as Tunisia faced the growing terrorist threat, particularly in the last decade, our approach to counterterrorism and violent extremism was placed at the center of the democratic process that has been taking place in our country. With the establishment of more transparent democratic process, countering terrorist effort has had to take into account the growing active role of civil society in Tunisia. From the beginning of the elaboration of a national counter-terrorism strategy to the reform and implementation of the relevant counter-terrorism legislation, NGOs' participation has been a constant key element in the process. However, one of the main lessons learned from this experience was that civil society participation did not only serve the requirement of transparency and participation dictated by the broader democratic process in the country. We have, in fact, seen tangible results of how civil society contributes to the efficiency of countering terrorism and violent extremism measures. One good example in this regard is terrorism financing. As we are seeking to enhance our national overall compliance with the Financial Action Task Force recommendation, the Tunisian Authority launched the National Cooperation Program with the civil society on the risk assessment of terrorism financing in the non-profit organization sector, NPOs. Through several workshops and the national questionnaire distributed to the NPOs, we were able not only to raise awareness among civil society organizations or donors on the risks, but the NPO sector was able to identify and assess in itself the nature of the risks to which it was exposed. This led to the establishment of a more accurate mechanism for prevention and management of terrorism financing. And as a result, Tunisia managed to be recently rated by FATF as fully compliant with recommendation number 8 of NPOs. This kind, I think, of best practices is something that we hope to highlight at the UN level, both during the GCTS review and throughout our chairmanship of CTC, in order to showcase that civil society participation is not only a slogan that we raise, but it is in fact a very useful tool to be utilized by the member state. For this reason, we need to ensure that the impact of counterterrorism measures on civil society are carefully assessed and mitigated.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Transparency and the contribution of CSOs, especially in the democratic process and in the fight for terrorism financing. Thank you very much. I'll pass now to the question for Ambassador Santos. Ambassador, Spain served this spring as a co-facilitator of the UN's biannual Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review. Because of COVID-19, the review has been delayed, giving us time to reflect further on the process. can you tell us about Spain's experience with the strategy review and the extent to which civil society can play a helpful role in the process? And also, do you have any reflections on civil society engagement in the future for other strategy review processes? You have the microphone.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody with being here with us to this debate. When we started preparing the renewal of the counter strategy, we immediately identified 4 or 5 areas where the strategy needs really to be upgraded. We have new cases of radical ideologies, supremacist, xenophobic, that needs to be tackled in the strategy. We have new technologies applied to terrorism, like cyber terrorism, that has a very big effect. We have also the problem of the narrative of the consequence of these years of fight against Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and in general what we have done in this area, and also the very central problem of how do we finance the counter-terrorism strategy of the United Nations, because as you know, until now, it has been done by voluntary contributions. And this needs to be changed if we consider that counter-terrorism is a central pillar of the activities of the United Nations. We reach a moment after having talked to all the regional groups and many member states that 2 regional groups decided that we needed to have not virtual meetings as we were having, but physical meetings in which they could present their positions. And this was the main reason why the whole thing was delayed 1 year, or we were given 1 more year to prepare our work on the counter-terrorism strategy. Now, we were not able until that moment really to reach directly civil society on our preparation for the new strategy. We were cut before that. But at least we hold 2 important seminars in which civil society was present. One was, well, from the UNOCT. They have reached and they maintain a continued dialogue with civil society. We participated in this. And then Spain also organized a seminar for the humanitarian aspects that have to be included in the counter strategy. Why is it so important to civil society? Because no counter strategy really can be built without a strong democratic consensus. And that strong democratic consensus have to come from 2 pillars. One is the parliamentary one. We need that the whole of our legislative bodies support the strategies. And the second one, we need also civil society organizations, because in many cases, they are the one on the field that are able to communicate more rapidly what is happening. And these are the 2 aspects that I really want to emphasize. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. You gave me additional 10 seconds, and I'll stick to that sentence that says, no counter strategy can be built without a strong democratic consensus, which of course includes civil society. Thank you very much for that. Now, to repair my damage, my mistake, I will now give the floor to Ambassador Kabtani to start with in this second round. Ambassador Kabtani, just as the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review was postponed due to COVID-19, we are here today on Zoom because of the pandemic. Tunisia has also been part of discussions on how to respond in the UN and has dealt with the pandemic at home. What can you tell us how the UN and its member states are reacting, and what thoughts can you share with us about the role of human rights and civil society in a global response to the pandemic?
Thank you. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the international community shifted most of its attention and resources to the COVID-19 crisis. As you all know, Tunisia has joined this effort by initiating a draft resolution to the Security Council, which aims at providing the multilateral response in this regard. And this draft is still under discussion in the Security Council. However, it is crucial that we don't lose sight of other priorities, particularly on countering terrorism and preserving human rights. In this framework, Tunisia multiplied its effort, particularly at the UN level, to ensure first that we keep the momentum on countering terrorism issues, and the second, that human rights and civil society remain an active part in the conversation. On the first level, we have witnessed how quickly terrorist groups adapt to the changing circumstances. They use the pandemic as an opportunity to spread and justify their rhetoric and to reorganize themselves while the rest of us are focused on the health crisis. For this reason, it was of great importance that the Security Council and particularly the CTC remain informed, united, and responsive against terrorism. Several mechanisms were put in place to ensure that the CTC continues delivering on its mandate effectively, including by monitoring the human rights compliance of counter-terrorism measures. On the second level, the unprecedented challenges posed by COVID-19 require member states to take exceptional measures, both domestically and at the UN level. As a result, human rights consideration and civil society participation were sometimes placed at the backseat, with the lack of resources and mechanism to engage with the UN virtually. More NGOs face the risk of being excluded from the conversation around the key counterterrorism issue. This happened within what is already considered a shrinking civil space. Tunisia has joined multiple initiatives to advocate for a continued respect of human rights standards during the pandemic, and is continuously working towards an open and transparent engagement with the civil society, including by inviting them to participate actively in open and closed CTC briefings.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. All your words are music to my ears, and I suppose for the audience as well. Thank you so much. I will now proceed with questions for Ms. Jilani. And I will ask her to unmute her microphone because it was muted by Dirk just before to answer the question. The UN's biannual global counterterrorism strategy does include reference to civil society, Ms. Jilani. It says something related to that civil society will be engaged as appropriate on how to enhance efforts to implement the strategy. Do you think this view of civil society as implementers of the GCTs is the right approach to engaging civil society in the UN's counterterrorism efforts? And if you can say something about this security and this tension between security and human rights approach that can be seen all around this conversation that we're having.
Look, first of all, I would like to answer the first part of your question. We are not just implementers. As both the honorable ambassadors have said, the participation of civil society is indispensable to have a clear, focused, and strong counterterrorism global policy. We must be a part of construction of that policy and not just a part of implementation of what has been already constructed as a strategy and given to us. When we talk about democratic consensus within the international community, we must remember that there is no notion of an international community minus the civil society. It is very much a part of what we call the international community. International community is not restricted just to states. That's one thing. The other thing is, how have we as the civil society been treated so far in the counterterrorism, by the counterterrorism architecture at the UN? we've always, the human rights community has always had a very uphill task in getting this integration of human rights into the global security structure. It is now amply clear that a formal recognition of human rights as a pillar of counterterrorism and mere lip service to human rights in the strategy text is not good enough. We have not seen the real integration of human rights into the security response. And talking about the civil society, let me also emphasize here that no counterterrorism strategy integrating human rights will be credible without the protection of human rights defenders and recognition of the right to defend human rights. Talking about the FATF regulations, in many countries, the National Plan of Action is now targeting NGOs and restricting foreign funding, for instance, and using these FATF regulations to limit the sphere of their activities, using surveillance and other security agencies to hound and harass them. So these are some things that our ambassadors need to hear also, what is happening on the ground. The need of the moment is to reset narratives and to push collectively for the integration of human rights into counterterrorism in the light of what I have said previously. The UN counterterrorism architecture must place human security at the center of its strategy. Together with civil society, a human security narrative must be developed that obliges states to remedy the destabilizing impact of terrorism and counterterrorism measures on communities and on individuals. Now, with regard to the tensions, human rights defenders have, themselves been the targets of terrorism. So we know what the threat of terrorism is. We have insisted throughout that the tensions between human rights and security are false tensions, and that the imperatives of security will only be served best when there is compliance, full compliance with international human rights law and international humanitarian. So that is there, we are very clear on this, and we hope that we can convince others within the UN to think of both human security and the integration of human rights in a way that they do not think that there is a tension between human rights and security.
Thank you so much, Hina. Thank you so much. Human security, human security, human security. We'll stick to that. Now, let me pass the microphone to Ms. Pillay. Navi, COVID-19 is a civil emergency of unquestioned urgency. Some have suggested that we should make use of the emergency frameworks and measures developed to counter terrorism to address this global pandemic. What do you see as the risk of doing so?
I think our discussion so far has alerted us to the risk of having the focus on any kind of health as a security issue. The standard is set out in the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, where the obligation is on states to ensure that the adopted measures comply with the conditions set out in that covenant, namely that they are necessary to combat the public health crisis, that they are reasonable and proportionate, and that they are lifted as soon as they are no longer necessary for protecting public health. Now, we were talking about having a fair balance between the imperative of national security and human rights. Now, even that has been very clear in the ICCPR, where, once again, the focus should be on protection of human rights. Now, COVID-19 reactions and responses all over the world understandably give rise to anxiety because many governments, including my own, have immediately brought in the army. An army being trained to kill immediately killed several people, handled them with great humiliation. They made them crawl on the pavement and so on. So they treated the people as the enemy instead of being there to protect and safeguard people against this virus. So the last thing we need is to have the security mechanism address a health issue. None of us is immune. in any part of the world from this pandemic. Very good research has been done. Every government has to base its measures on what the scientists tell us and their predictions. It is an unknown factor. This addressing COVID-19 cannot be left to politicians. It has to be handled by the scientific community with the full involvement of civil society, because it's civil society who is truly informed on the local drivers and factors on the ground and how best to protect civil society. Using the military or security mechanism has produced bizarre results in many countries, because they've decided whether you can walk on the beach and whether you can buy shoes or sandals. These are some examples from my country. But above all, they have used violence against civil society to get them to conform to regulations that actually are necessary, but they have been adopted arbitrarily. Civil society's voice is needed in respect of those regulations to counter COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Navi. The last thing we need is security to address health issues.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Last question before we go to the public, for Ambassador Santos. Spain co-chairs the group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism, and Spain also has a history of dealing with terrorism at home, just like my country, Colombia. What lessons has Spain learned on the articulation of victims' rights and the relationship between protecting the rights of victims and the rights of the rest of society? Ambassador, you have to unmute yourself. Right.
Here I am. Yes, with Afghanistan, we have this group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism, and we have been trying to discuss about the best practice. Let me go to the logic of it. The main objective of any terrorist action is to break the democratic consensus and the rule of law. But that can also be explained as destroying the basis, the political, the social, and the economic basis of citizenship that allows that any democracy to function. So restoring those conditions of citizenship, first to the victims who have really been harmed in their livelihoods, in the personal well-being, or in the political rights, and of the whole of society, reestablishing the democratic functioning of society is the first objective in any country strategy against terrorism. And we need to delegitimize the terrorist action by reconstructing the political space in which all these actors can take place. And the self-organization of the victims is central to this. First, because you restore to them visibility, you restore to them the democratic rights, and by doing that, the whole of society takes responsibility on the fight against the anti-democratic tactics of terrorism. And last year we had the resolution for the enhancement of international cooperation for the victims of terrorism. This allowed us to create the group of friends. We have been working on that basis, and we were preparing also with the UN or OCT, the first Congress of Victims of Terrorism, to try to equalize, to try to learn from best practices of all countries. It was to take place this month of June. Unfortunately, because COVID-19, we'll have to postpone it 1 year. But this is going to be also a central piece in putting victims in the center of our counter-terrorism strategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Victims in the center, but the whole of society takes part. Thank you very much. I live with that. So we'll pass now to the questions of the public. We will start with a question for Hina. My question is, how do we better communicate the value of human rights in counterterrorism processes to mass working population versus keeping communication at the middle class academic world level? We need simplification and cut through. Thank you to Hina and the UN and others doing all this to perfect protect rights and civil society in Pakistan amidst counterterrorism. So you have the floor, Hina. Hina, you have to unmute.
Organizations and international human rights organizations such as the OMCT, are already engaging their networks in making these realities visible and for suggesting appropriate strategies to counter terrorism. I'm sure that not only general publics where counterterrorism measures are taking their toll on freedoms will benefit from more and more conversations and interaction with these human rights networks. And I also feel that the UN bodies as well need to keep their ears open to these discussions and what people are saying right now.
Thank you, Hina. Thank you very much. So you do agree with this need of simplification of the language and the communications so that we reach all the audiences?
People who are experiencing these know what the realities are. They just need more and more support and confirmation of their fears from others. So people do get together, language is simplified when these networks of people working on the ground are engaging with those victims or those communities, whether they, in the south or the north, who are suffering the consequences that are taking away their freedoms or taking away human security.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Hina. I will pass on the microphone to the Ambassador Santos. Ambassador Santos, what concrete active steps they think might help ensure CSOs are involved in the 2021 GCT's review?
Well, we have to try to disguise strategy. Obviously, to do that, we need to organize seminars in a regional way. We have to try to contact and make a network. I know that the UNOCT is already working on that, a network of organizations of civil society, different aspects, from victims to those who human rights activists, any kind of activities of that. And through connecting those networks with our normal work, our institutional work, I think we will be able to capture the priorities and the debate which is on the basis of all this exercise. We know very well that the problem is of the counter-terrorist strategies many times are that they are used to justified squeezing the democratic rights of the whole of the population in the name that we are reproducing the same objectives that the terrorist action tries to do. And this is why it's so important to bring a counter narrative to this. And only civil society can do that. How we do it? Well, we have the normal mechanism, the democratic normal mechanism in all our states. And second, to try to reach from the United Nations in an open dialogue with all those civil society networks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. A network of organizations connected with the UN in an open dialogue and not reproducing narratives that terrorism is spreading through. Thank you very much. Now a question for Navi Pillay. Navi, if the UN actually truly reformed to put human rights at the center of counterterrorism, what would that look like? What would be different than today if that happened?
Well, if that happens, then governments will become more accountable. Here's the Security Council resolution of 2003. All the states undertook that obligation, that all their counterterrorism measures will comply with international human rights law, refugee law, and so on, and that they will try to achieve a fair balance between legitimate national security concerns and the protection of fundamental freedoms. You know, civil society has very little space now for their voices to be heard. They're shouting outside there. So I am calling for greater accountability on the part of governments. You know your obligations. You know your responsibility to protect people within your jurisdiction. And that is how you should be adopting measures. Now, if that happens, if governments comply with the obligations that they've undertaken, the UN would then be a totally different place. It wouldn't be like now, where they exercise power and civil society is outside here trying to get a small space to speak up. So I do hope that Ambassador Santos Maraver, who is in a position to influence how these discussions in the CT are held, will provide that democratic space for NGOs. It's civil society that is in touch with conditions on the ground. They're in such a good position to inform you, and I include the journalists as well as experts who study these issues.
Thank you very much, Navi. We also expect that and wait for some advancements in that respect, and hopefully governments would become more accountable. Thank you so much. Now I think we can turn to Tunisia, to the Ambassador Kabtani. The biggest challenge, perhaps, is to involve the larger civil society in this whole debate of counterterrorism and human rights, especially when there is a huge section of the civil society which still feels that terrorism is not their problem, but the problem of the security agencies, and it's up to the state to deal with it. How do you overcome this challenge? How can you increase the participation of the common man on this and woman in this issue?
As I already mentioned, the civil society is a key partner in the fight against terrorism, and you cannot adopt an inclusive and comprehensive answer if you do not involve all key social and civil societies actors. We strongly believe about the participation of civil society, including, of course, of women, and Tunisia is a strong advocate of women in the MENA region as a whole. And of course, even our national counterterrorism strategy is based on the involvement and engagement of the civil society, particularly of women in the fight against not only against the counterterrorism, but including in the de-radicalization, and it is strong. We count on their strong participation mainly in the first part of our national strategy, which is on the prevention. So we are clear about their participation and about their contribution in the national effort.
Very well, thank you so much, Ambassador. And there is a last question for Ambassador Kabtani as well. The person that asked the question wants to know what are the concrete steps that Tunisia's chair of the CTC suggest and take to ensure that the fourth pillar is adequately and properly integrated into the work of the Security Council. How can human rights be properly mainstreamed into the Security Council work on CT?
Of course, Tunisia, as the chairman of the CTC, is very eager to protect this dimension in its work, and we share with our member of Security Council this concern, and we believe that the fight against terrorism should not be at the expense of human rights, and that the counterterrorism measure cannot be expanded to other contexts, including COVID response. Any misuse of counterterrorism measure that does not respect human rights requirement, of course, will eventually be counterproductive and inefficient.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have reached the end of this opening panel. I would like to thank all the organizers, and I would like to thank especially the panelists. You've been outstanding. I've learned a lot with all of you. I would just like to end following a tweet that I read recently from Antonio Guterres from the United Nations regarding the fight against racism. He said, we can move forward with introspection, honesty, and action. And that's what I think we can expect for the coming weeks and months in this counterterrorism strategy, that we would want it to have civil society with an effective participation and with human security in the center. Thank you very much, everybody.